11 Incoterms 2020 rules. These globally recognized trade terms, published by the International Chamber of Commerce, determine how costs and risks are split between buyers and sellers conducting international transactions, and when the risk or liability for the goods transfer from the seller to the buyer. Today I'll take a closer look at the Incoterms rule FCA, or free carrier. But first, make sure you're subscribed to this channel so you don't miss any of our basics of exporting videos, sharing practical advice for exporters and importers. Here's what you need to know before using the Incoterm FCA, or free carrier. Under FCA, the seller loads the goods on the buyer's transport at the seller's premises, or the seller delivers them to another named place. Most often, the buyer hires transportation to pick the goods up at the seller's warehouse. The seller must load the goods on the buyer's transport, at which point the risk for the goods transfers to the buyer. Alternatively, the seller and buyer may agree to have the seller transport the goods to a place other than the seller's warehouse, like a freight forwarder's warehouse or a carrier's terminal. The risk or liability for the goods transfers from the seller to the buyer when the goods are made available at the named place. The buyer is responsible for unloading the goods from the seller's transport. In both cases, the seller should package the goods appropriately or as specified in the agreement. The seller is also responsible for export clearance. FCA can be used for any mode of transport: air, courier, truck, rail, vessel, or multimodal shipments. Most Incoterms experts argue that FCA is the best Incoterm to use when the buyer is arranging the main international transportation, and sellers often choose it because they think it takes less effort on their part. FCA is certainly a better choice than Ex-Works, which many U.S. companies like to use, but it puts responsibility for export clearance on the seller, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it can put the use of FCA in conflict with U.S. foreign trade regulations. The FTR calls exports where the buyer arranges the international transportation a routed export transaction. It requires the buyer to give written authorization to a U.S. party to file EEI through AES. Under an F group rule, the at named place is on the seller's side, but the buyer hires the main carrier and freight forwarder. The seller does not control shipments under the F term, so the freight forwarder and carrier have no obligation to the seller. This has caused problems in the past when selling under a letter of credit, because international carriers would have no reason to provide the bill of lading to the seller, who would typically need it to get paid under a letter of credit. With the latest set of Incoterms, the Incoterms 2020 rules, the buyer can instruct its carrier to issue a bill of lading with an on-board notation to the seller, so that the seller can satisfy the terms of a letter of credit. If you are regularly involved in international trade, you need to understand the risks and responsibilities for each of the Incoterms 2020 rules, not just pick the term you'll always use. Shipping Solutions is here to help. Download our free chart of responsibilities to compare all 11 Incoterms and our free white paper and introduction to Incoterms. You'll find links below. If you liked this video, like it, share it, and make sure you're subscribed to our channel. Watch for more videos sharing real practical advice for exporters and importers.